Hi, and welcome to the Church Renewal Podcast. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, and today on the podcast, we're talking about the 5 foundations of Church Renewal. Here in Season 2, we've been working our way through building blocks of Church Renewal, and in today's episode, we talk about 5 foundational assumptions that we would hope would be in place before a church would begin an intentional renewal and revitalization journey. If not in action, if not functioning, at least in their heart and in their commitment, that they would be committed to these 5 things. Matt Bowling from our team of coaches joins us today for the conversation. So why don't you come along as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church? All right, Matt, welcome back to the podcast. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Oh, you know what? It's another beautiful sunny day in Western Pennsylvania, and by sunny in Western Pennsylvania, I mean partially cloudy, because that's what sunny is most of June.
Do you know what I did today?
No, what'd you do today?
I went to Starbucks.
Oh, is this your first venture back to Starbucks since
I had a sausage cheddar and egg sandwich for the first time in months. I am levitating above my seat at the moment. I'm drinking Starbucks brewed from Starbucks coffee in my Starbucks mug. Oh. I could not be happier today.
It really is the little things in life, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Sausage, cheddar, and egg can make any day better.
Well, let's get into the heart of the material today. Our goal today is to try to lay some foundation stones. We've been talking about the building blocks of church renewal. We've discussed the church life cycle. We've discussed the importance of pastors and ministry leaders, taking hold of the gospel for themselves. And we're going to get into the actual process of renewing a local church. And I think, Matt, you would say that the process of church renewal isn't a set of steps. Well, isn't a program that every church is going to go through in kind of a one size fits all.
Sure, right.
Mentality. But it is still a process. So what's the difference between like a program that has one size fits all and a process that might look different in different places?
Yeah, so a program applies itself similarly across churches. So, common program of the 2000s was Rick Warren's, 40 Days of Purpose for churches. And churches read Purpose Driven Life, but church that I pastored read it. Not unuseful, not unhelpful, but the difficulty with it, and we'll get into this in subsequent episodes, the difficulty with it is that it doesn't necessarily address the most critical issues first that are facing this church. It assumes that by applying the program, the most critical issues facing this church are going to get addressed. And what we've discovered in our church health assessment is that when we do that with churches, it's like, yeah, maybe this program here or there could help. But in reality, this would have to change first in order for this church to go anywhere. Maybe we've talked about in the podcast that one client that we had where they had the 2 elders that were now retired. Have we talked about this on the podcast? I don't know if we ever have.
Maybe, yeah.
So we helped a church where there were 2 elders that were the founding elders of the church, and they were now not serving as elders, except they still pulled all the levers in the background.
Right.
And that church actually was earnest to change and to be different and to grow, and it's evangelism and it's prayer and everything, but nothing could change unless those 2 guys signed off on it, and they were not interested in signing off on the other things that the church really needed it to do. And so the first thing that had to happen in that case would have never shown up in a program, right? Which is to deal with a power structure that was broken. And there's a whole host of things like that. And we'll get into this in later episodes, but there's a whole host of things that can actually be the first thing that has to be dealt with in a church. That's what a program lacks. It lacks the diagnostic, element that would tell you what's most holding back this church right now. What's that blocker that's in the way of gospel fruitfulness?
Right. So before we get into, and I think we're going to talk in the next episode about the kind of theory behind the process of church renewal. But in this episode, we're talking about these foundation stones that really need to be in place, if not functioning, at least aspirationally, in place if a church wants to begin the journey of church renewal? Let me read down the list of these five, and Matt will then work through them for our listeners. So these five aspects that really need to be in place, five assumptions, five foundational blocks that need to be in place. First, kingdom prayer. Second, a biblical mission, vision, and values. Third, gospel centrality. Fourth, kingdom urgency. And fifth, the reassertion of Jesus' scorecard. So, kingdom prayer, biblical mission, vision, values, gospel centrality, kingdom urgency, and reasserting Jesus' scorecard. Let's start at the top of the list there, Matt. We've talked on the podcast before about prayer and church renewal. What do you mean by kingdom prayer, and why is it so foundational for the process of church renewal?
So, prayer is essential for the healthy functioning of any individual Christian, right? God made us for himself. We're restless until we find our rest in him. The way that we express that we're resting in him, that we enjoy him, that we treat him as a person walking with us, even within us by the Spirit, is by praying. So we demonstrate as an individual Christian that we get the Christian life, and maybe even that we are a Christian, by prayer, and not just sort of set prayer like at meal times or when you have a quiet time, but prayer that's more frequent than that, right? That's we would say is that the healthy functioning Christian. We talk about for pastors that they need both transactional prayer for people that don't know Jesus and for their family members, for themselves, but they also need long form prayer to really wrestle through the difficult things, right? So the healthy functioning of individual Christians or church leaders requires prayer. When you collect those people together, their instinct, if it's a healthy church, is to pray. But it's to take those similar kinds of concerns that they have individually and to collect them together as a group. And so we call this kingdom prayer. This is much more than a nod, but then more of an acknowledgement of the long good work of our chief parish. And we can link some of the stuff in the show notes.
Yeah, in fact, you've reviewed Parish's book on kingdom prayer, and so we'll link that review in the show notes here.
So when we say kingdom prayer, we're talking about the kind of desperate prayer, dependent prayer, cooperatively, congregationally, in small groups. The form of that can be a lot of different ways. We could talk about that another time. But the idea is that we are collected together as a congregation to pray specifically by name for individual people that don't know Jesus. We are praying by name, thy kingdom come, that Satan's kingdom would be destroyed, that we and others would be drawn into it, as our catechism and our tradition says. It's a very strong statement just to teach and to lead in light of what the catechism has to say about that petition, particularly the larger catechism. And so it's a group of people that own that and say, if Satan, 2 Corinthians 2, maybe, Satan is actively blinding the minds of unbelievers. No man comes to me unless the Father draws him. And so we have to pray that Satan's blinders would be removed and that the Father by the Spirit would draw people to Christ. And that Jesus desires for us to do. That's kingdom prayer. Does that give you the nugget, Alan, what you're looking for?
And so what is it about that mentality or that commitment to praying that is a prerequisite for a church endeavoring to do renewal? Why do we call it a foundational thing for a church that wants to experience new life?
So it's a common phrase among people that plant churches that every time a church is planted, it's a miracle. You're trying to do something that's impossible. You're trying to bring life out of death, right? You're trying to bring into existence something that wasn't before. And it's not like bringing a business into existence. It's not even like something like Flourish, bringing Flourish into existence. We had pre-existing clients when we started. I mean, it's not even like that. You got nothing. You need a miracle. You need God to work for this church to go from nothing to planted, self-supporting with his own leadership, right? Is church renewal less hard than church planting or more hard than church planting?
Right.
Or is it even, without even trying to like equate them, Is it just that they're both hard and they both require a miracle? And they both do require a miracle. And so if we're trying to see a miracle happen, we need the one who makes miracles happen, which is God. And so we have to plead with God, because church renewal requires a work of God.
Yeah. So for a church to begin the process of renewing and revitalizing their mission and ministry, they have to understand this foundational element of prayer that is not just for the physical needs of the people in the body, but prayer that is for the transformation and reformation spiritually of the people and the advancement of the kingdom in the place God has called them. And that kind of gets us to the second foundational. If the first is
Can I
kingdom
add one
prayer.
more?
Oh,
Can I add one
sorry.
more?
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I just thought of something else. I think that it's also a different kind of praying for ourselves. It's a praying of repentance for, I was recently talking with a client about this, for our love of comfort, for our prioritizing ourselves and our families. It's a asking God for a heart for those who are not yet, who don't yet know Christ. And so it's a different kind of praying, even for ourselves, that God would change our hearts, reprioritize our lives, change our spending and our time use and our energy and our own family priorities so that they surround people that don't know Jesus. Sorry. All right.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's helpful. It's not just a commitment to prayer in general, but a specific commitment to praying with expectation that the kingdom is going to advance in us and through the ministry of this church.
Yes.
So that leads us to our second kind of foundation stone. And our second foundation stone here is that before a congregation engages on a journey of church renewal or revitalization, they need to have a clear uh, biblical mission, vision, and shared values. Now, that sounds like something you would do in the process of church renewal, which you might. But at least there has to be some sort of core commitment to a common biblical mission, vision, and values. Is that just the church saying, "Hey, we're committed to the Great Commission"? That's a biblical mission, or do you mean something beyond that?
Well, I think I mean something beyond that. So lots of churches say they're committed to the Great Commission because they give 10% of their budget to overseas missions, or maybe they give 10% of their budget between church planting and other community organizations and overseas missions. Right? They say we're committed to the Great Commission because, and look at how we spend our money.
Right.
But they are not personally and corporately oriented as a ministry around seeing the Great Commission come to fulfillment in their zip code through them. That's what I mean by biblical mission. Is that a biblical mission statement is always it is always a restatement, if you even make one, because it's simply a restatement of the Great Commission. The virtue of it in doing it, it can be wise to, is just to say, yeah, this is actually what we're prioritized around. Period. Full stop. Right. We want to see people come to know Jesus and be discipled in Him, to make progress across that Great Commission continuum. That kind of neat diagram, but anyways, we can talk about it another time.
Yeah.
So
I think the other side of this, though, is not just a mission, vision, and values. Every organization that is thoughtful about who they are should have an articulated mission, vision, and values. But for the church, we would say that you need to have a particularly biblical mission, vision, and values. There are churches, large and small, denominational and non-denominational, who have moved away from the Bible as the source of their mission, vision, and values. Church A can be super engaged in ministry to the local community, and Church B can be doing the same. One can be doing it because they are convinced that the kingdom of God is on the move, that Christ is gathering the people to Himself and using the preaching of the gospel to do it. The other, Church B, might be super engaged in ministry to the community because they want a good reputation, and they're more driven by, I don't want to be, we're creating a scenario here, but they're more driven by either getting more butts in the seats, or they're more driven by, a commitment to a social gospel, and
Looking
not a
respectable,
yeah,
looking
looking
respectable.
respectable, being good people. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be and do good. There's nothing wrong with wanting the gospel to affect society. There's nothing wrong with wanting to see your church grow. But the same fruit, being involved in ministry in the community, could have different roots. A biblical mission versus a mission that might grab the Bible for a verse or two, but is not rooted in the Bible's understanding of the mission of the church.
Can I give you a quote from a client?
Yeah, sure.
Was doing an interview of a client. We're doing a church health assessment, and a client doing the interview, following up on our, kind of our survey portion of our diagnostic of our assessment, and was talking about the Great Commission because it was a clear weakness in this church based on their survey stuff. And so I was asking about this with a client or in an interview, and the interviewee was just honest and said, I hear you talking about the Great Commission and trying to see the conversion of people. And he says, this is a 12-year-old church. He said, I don't think our church has ever been about that. And I was just flabbergasted. I didn't even know. You're not supposed to like be ruffled when you do interviews. I was just flabbergasted. I couldn't even, I didn't even know what to say. How could a church that was only planted 12 years ago have not had an institutional memory of seeking the conversion of people from unbelief? Because that's the reason that today dawned. We're going to get to that further down on this list, but that's the whole reason today dawned, is because Jesus is still gathering his people and using us to do it. And it was flabbergasting that they had completely lost this biblical mission, right?
Yeah.
So you want to go on to vision or no?
Well, I don't think we're gonna. I think because we want to kind of work through all five of these. Suffice it to say, this second stone is really about before you begin a process of renewal and revitalization, you need to pause and check: is the reason we exist, is the direction we're heading, and are the things we hold deeply in common, do they come from God's word and do they animate our lives? Right? If you're beginning a process of renewal because your budget's in trouble and you want to get comfortable again, or because the church used to have glory days and it doesn't anymore, those aren't good foundations for a renewal and revitalization process. But a biblical mission, vision, and shared values are. So kingdom prayer, biblical mission, vision, values. The third foundation stone here is gospel centrality. What does it mean for a church to have the gospel at its center? What does that look like for a church to have the gospel as its center?
Yeah. So what I would say is that it not only the gospel is proclaimed from the pulpit, from person to person, because we still need the gospel. That's the whole New Testament message, is that we believers keep needing to hear the gospel. And I think that when it goes from that not just that I have a gospel outline memorized, although that's useful, not just the gospel preached in the pulpit, but functionally, the gospel sits at the middle in terms of if we were to take the last one and to push it down a little bit into philosophy of ministry, that we believe the way that people actually change is through understanding the gospel more deeply and applying it more broadly. That a fruit of that is that functionally we put the gospel at the center of the church. That is what people are hearing everywhere, thoughtfully applied to lots of different issues, taking away misconceptions, but functionally the gospel sits at the center of the ministry. And all we're doing here is trying to find some way to put in English the way that the Apostle Paul worked his ministry, the way that he helped churches that had lost their way. That's most of the New Testament. What do? Even Hebrews and Revelation, where Jesus is speaking, right? What are they doing? Putting the gospel back at the center. So functionally, the gospel is in the center. Right. And then I think that when the gospel is functionally at the center, the second way that the gospel needs to be central is that that people are actually experiencing transformation under the gospel. And so, the pastor, the elders, they're experiencing transformation under the gospel. And so when they are, that's what they give away. Alan and I were talking before we started recording this morning, and I was telling him about a new book that I'm going to do a resource review, so you'll be able to read it on the blog. And maybe we can time it for it comes out with this podcast. We'll see. But the idea is that if I'm understanding the gospel more deeply and applying it more broadly, my life's going to be transformed. If a church ministry is oriented around that, then the gospel is functionally central, right? Is that too tight, too terse?
No, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
And I think it's important to distinguish there are good things in the life of the church that compete with the gospel for the center of the church's life. A particular style or preference or conviction about worship, a particular theological perspective, a particular commitment to have no distinctive tradition or theological perspective. There are lots of things that compete for the identity of local congregations. You can be a church with a very particular theological perspective and worship conviction and still have the gospel as the center of your church. And you can be a church with no particular distinctive tradition or theological conviction and not have the gospel at the center of your church.
Yeah, and this point that Alan's making is a very good one, which is that in our tradition, we'll have heavily theological churches, which we're both of us, that is, Alan, if you prick us, that's what you're going to get, which may surprise some of our listeners, but that is both of us.
Yep.
Because it was at the core of who Flourish is. But that does not mean that you can't have the gospel at the center of a ministry. It's what we've all pursued as we've done ministry through time. And it also means that if you're not in a heavily theological tradition, it doesn't matter. I was speaking recently with a new acquaintance who was talking about his experience in a church in another part of the country that whose theology is very different than my own, but was talking about how our that this particular church is very important to them, that they have an allegiance with Israel. You might go to another church that has a particular view of prophecy, or another church that's very exercised. The week that we're recording this, a significant Supreme Court decisions come out. You have another church that's very interested in progressive social issues or conservative social perspective on issues, right? But functionally, someone goes to the church for 6 months and you ask them, what sits at the center of this church's ministry? How do these people anticipate people being changed? What's important to this church? That's how you know if the gospel's central.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so building block number 3, we've done kingdom prayer, biblical mission, vision, values, gospel centrality. Building block number 4, kingdom urgency. That before a local congregation, or for that matter, a regional group of churches or a denomination, embarks on an intentional renewal plan and process, there needs to be a sense of urgency for the advancing of the kingdom. What does a kingdom urgency look like, Matt, in a local congregation? And what does kingdom urgency look like in a local congregation?
Sure. So I think that so if I get done with this particular segment with Alan, and I've already had a quart of water and I'm partway through my coffee, there's a decent likelihood that I will have an urgency as an older man to visit the restroom, right? So how do you know when somebody has an urgency towards something? Well, it animates them. It moves them. It orients them, right? So we frequently in the podcast and the Ministry of Flourish, we sort of paraphrase Matthew 24:14. There's a lot of things about Matthew 24 that are challenging. This verse is not a particularly hard one to understand. Let me read it to you. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That to me is Jesus orienting us towards what ought to animate our lives. That he's telling us this is what it looks like between now and the end of time. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as testimony to all nations. And most all the people that are listening to this, you may be thinking about the nations as, sub-Saharan Africa, which and the Middle East, wonderful places where the gospel is growing. It's really, really cool what the Lord's doing in the Southern Hemisphere. Absolutely awesome. But realize that if you are outside of um, Palestine, you live in the nations. If
Right.
you're particularly in North America or in Western Europe, you live in the nations. That's what this is considering. So that means that Jesus is calling to you today. The reason today dawned is because this gospel of the kingdom is being proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, as we anticipate that the end will come. So here's the way I like to put it. Alan, did today dawn?
Yes, today dawned.
Today dawned. Why did today dawn?
Because Jesus is still gathering a people for himself.
And using us to do it. That is the only sufficient reason today dawned. Does that mean that I need to and ought to love to love my wife and my children, to appreciate Alan as an employee, to be faithful to our clients? Yes, of course, all of those are important, but none of those are the sufficient reason that today dawned. The only sufficient reason today dawned is because Jesus is yet gathering a people. When that orients us, when we realize that that's the reason that every local congregation exists, and orients us in a sense where it is at the center of our conversations about why we do things and what we don't do, because we think the kingdom and the coming of the kingdom and our participation in that is the most urgent thing. That's a prerequisite to renewal, to recapture that, right? That kingdom urgency.
Right. So, Matt, there are congregations that have a sense of urgency, and the literature about church revitalization and renewal says that, from what I've read, says that a certain degree of desperation is really necessary for a church to turn around. But sometimes that urgency isn't motivated by the advancing kingdom. It's motivated by fear. It's motivated by guilt. It's motivated by, fear. What happens if this church closes? Guilt. We should have done a better job. Let's just try harder. I think, yeah. I think any degree of urgency is going to be helpful in changing an organization like a church. But how do you move from an unhealthy urgency to a healthy urgency?
I think it's knowing which is a cart and which is a horse.
Okay.
It's knowing which comes first and what is root and what is fruit. Being able to stay in a building, being able to meet budget, having a congregation that continues, those are all fruits. They are fruits of new people coming to Christ and being discipled in Him. That's what enables congregations over the long term to stay together. Just working on a blog post right now that has that talks about spiritual entropy. My seminary mentor talked about this, the second law of spiritual thermodynamics. That just as physicists theorize and they observe that things that are hot go to cold. You turn the burner off, you're not adding energy to the frying pan. What happens? It goes from hot to cold. That's the concept of entropy.
It doesn't just keep getting hot. Without heat applied, it doesn't get hotter, right?
Exactly. And so in a sense, that same thing is observable in the spiritual realm, right? What's the story of all the epistles in the New Testament? Spiritual entropy.
Right.
They lost focus. They got away from responding to God's love with love by the way they treated each other and by the way they reached out with the gospel. They experienced spiritual entropy. And so this urgency is that reapplication from Jesus that we plead for and ask for, and the Spirit gives us, that we would be energized for the sake of the kingdom. That's the root of which other things are the fruit. The things that we fear happening, right? Can't make budget. We have to let staff go. We can't stay in this building. Our congregation goes out of existence. Those things that we fear, right? Maybe we feel guilty about choices we've made or shame for the ways we've handled ourselves or whatever, right? The um what those are not sufficient kinds of fires to keep us going though. They will run out. They're insufficient gas. Instead, as we re-understand the gospel and as we receive Jesus' mission towards us, it ought to give us an urgency, and that's that reapplication of heat that moves us out.
Mm-hmm. So get the right heat to get the right urgency.
Yep. Get the right urgency.
All right. So 4 blocks that we've looked at, 4 foundation stones: kingdom prayer, biblical mission, vision, values, gospel centrality, kingdom urgency, and the last one is reasserting Jesus scorecard. Now we're gonna get more into the Jesus scorecard. That's some like flourish language that we've been kicking around here. Jesus scorecard for church renewal. In a prior life, I worked in consulting for manufacturing and healthcare, and we talked about operational scorecards for organizations. I can see some listeners cringing at the idea that there would be a scorecard for the church. Some folks cringing because that just sounds like corporate speak. Other folks cringing because the idea of a scorecard cuts against the idea that God is God of grace and love and mercy, and how He doesn't keep score. So Matt, just do the apologetic right at the top here. What do you mean? Why does a church need a scorecard? And what is Jesus' scorecard?
Okay, so every church has a scorecard. It's inevitable.
Okay.
When you ask a church leader, how's your church doing? What comes out of their mouth is the scorecard they're using.
Yes. They have something in the background, something that they're using. Okay.
So in this we've recorded some of our teaching, and one of the things that we talk about a church in recline is that it's scoring different things than the church that's in incline. So a church that's in recline is scoring things like, the motto of a church in recline is "We made it." And what does it mean that we made it? Like if you're a church plant and you get to that spot where you say we made it, what does it mean? You have enough staff, you have a stable building facility, you have enough money, and ministry is functioning in the way that you wanted it to, and you can kind of sit back in your recliner and go, whew, we made it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so those are the things that you're scoring. The church that's on incline is scoring very, very different things. It's scoring things like, have we seen people come to Jesus? What is our kingdom prayer like? What's the quality and the fervency and the duration of it? Who are the people that we are in contact with that don't know Jesus distributed among the congregation? Are they being prayed for by name? Mm-hmm. Have we seen the baptism of adult converts from unbelief to belief in Christ? Are the people that we have, Jesus said, make disciples, not make converts, right? But disciples start as unbelievers because we're going to the nations. So not only are we seeing people come to Christ, are we seeing people make progress across that discipleship continuum? Are our people experiencing transformation under the gospel where they are maturing? Paul says to Timothy, let your progress be obvious, be made known, right? So this is supposed to, if you can make a disciple, we should ask ourselves, are we making any? Mm-hmm. And the ones we have, or are they stuck kind of repeating year one every year, right? Or are they actually making progress? And so these are the kinds of things with this last list that I've done that are on the scorecard of a church that's on incline because they're aligned with Jesus' priorities. You can't find in the New Testament, have staff, have enough money, have a building, do these ministries. You can't find any of that in the New Testament.
Uh-huh.
What you find in the New Testament is, are you seeing people come to Jesus? Are they getting baptized? Are they making progress in their faith?
And yeah. Is the congregation growing in their love and understanding of God and one another? Right. So much of the New Testament is about conflict in churches, and so if your church is growing in spiritual and emotional maturity, then those kind of issues are going to be addressed along the way.
Absolutely. The one another commands are going to be fulfilled People are going to be um, expressing the fruit of the Spirit in increasing measure, right? Those kinds of things, right? They're going to be oriented around the kingdom and around people that don't know Jesus, right? So those are the things that a church that's on incline, that's embracing what we call Jesus scorecard. That's the kinds of things they're scoring, right? That's what they're thinking about.
So Matt, if a church is ready to reassert Jesus scorecard, if they're committed to these things like a biblical mission, kingdom prayer, kingdom urgency, and the gospel is the center, um, we would say that a church that has these 5 foundation stones in place, that they are ripe. They're like ripe fruit when it comes to church renewal. Um, from the outside, what does that look like? What does it look like for a church to be ripe and ready for renewal?
I think it's a church that's humbled,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, because when we as individual unbelievers or as individual believers, when we realize that we're experiencing that spiritual heat loss, right? What do? Uh, we humble ourselves. We repent. We go, Lord, your love uh, ought to be responded to by me gladly with love for you and love for others. And I've not been doing that. And so I repent. I humble myself, right? And so a church that looks like this is humbled. It's repentant for getting off on other things instead of being they've gotten off mission, right? They've been about other things than Jesus, what's on Jesus' scorecard. So I think they're humbled. They're prayerful, um, and and I think that praying has changed, right? It's much more about the kinds of things that we're talking about, right? Jesus, help me understand the gospel in such a way that my life is changed,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
it's different. Lord, help us as a church um, have the sort of clarity about how you would want us to see the Great Commission fulfilled in this place, that we would go about it and live out these biblical values that you've given to us,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a very humble, prayerful, dependent, repentant bunch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different than the way a lot of our churches are perceived, because it's different than the way a lot of our churches are.
Mm-hmm. I think that when we're asked to work with a church, you can kind of smell when you walk into the room. Does this place smell like they are hungry to see God work, or does it smell like they are hungry to be successful? And a church is ripe for renewal if they are hungry to see God move and work through their church. Next time that you and I are together, we're going to get into the kind of theory of the process, right? So Flourish doesn't say that there's a one size fits all program for church renewal, but renewal is a process, and there's some theory behind that process. So if a church has got these, if local congregations got these kind of foundation stones in place, they can begin to build on top of it. So next time we're going to talk about how to build on it. Until then, Matt, there are some great resources on these issues that we'll link to in the show notes. But if I'm listening today and I'm thinking, yeah, I think we're ready. I think we've had a series of challenges, but we're ready for fresh wind in our congregation. If that listener is out there today, what would you say to encourage them that 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 renewal and revitalization are actually possible?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is cherish already that God has begun a work. Celebrate that if that is really where you guys are, God has already begun. He is already demonstrating that He is for you and that He wants to bring renewal to your congregation. And that's to be enjoyed and reveled in and sought even more deeply. I think that maybe a second thing is, what's our first step? What's the next best thing that God would have us do?
The next best thing. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the next best thing
Mm-hmm.
that God would have us do? I did a resource review on that book, and it's applicable not only to individual people, but to congregations. What's the next thing that God would have us do? What's the first step that He would have us take? And I think that it then begins to form your prayers. He's changed our hearts already. then we start asking, what's the next thing that we need to take care of?
Yeah. Well, we'll be praying about that for our listeners to find the next best thing. And the next best thing for us is to wrap up the podcast here. I'm hearing Anna's voice from Frozen 2 singing, "Do the next right thing." my 2-year-old is obsessed with Frozen 2, and so on that note, let's wrap up the podcast. Matt, thanks for being with us today. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. The Church Renewal podcast is a ministry of Flourish Coaching. When churches and pastors feel stuck and they need their hope in the gospel renewed, they need clarify their strategy for renewal, a Flourish coach is there to come alongside them. You can reach out to Flourish on the web at flourishcoaching.org. That's flourishcoaching.org. And you can reach me. I'm the host of the podcast and the director of operations at Flourish. I'm Alan. That's ALLAN at flourishcoaching.org. There's only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and it is that Jesus is yet gathering a church to himself, a people to himself. And he ordinarily uses the proclamation of the gospel through the ministry and the lives of the local church to do that. So if you believe that Jesus is still gathering people and you can use your church to do it, then join us next time as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.